When I grew up, and I told you that I retired the last time a few years ago when I was 70. When I grew up, some of you who have got my hair color grew up as well. And there were practically two worldviews at that time. It was the spiritual worldview, and you could access that through the Bible, through spiritual things, through revelation. Or there was the physical worldview, the scientific worldview, the worldview which has been the worldview of communism solely, for example. But our kids grow up in a different world. There are at least three worldviews. You know, when I learned English, and we learned the word bits, we learned that bits are being put into the horse's mouth. Remember? That was the old language. Or when we heard about the clouds, you're hanging in the clouds, we thought of meteorology. Young people don't understand those words anymore, or they understand them differently. Today, we are in the time of gigabytes and terabytes and petabytes. Any one of you having on his computer the access to petabytes? I don't think so. I think all the knowledge in the world would fit on probably 10 petabytes. So probably in Penrith Church no one would have petabytes on his computer. Would be a bit expensive as well. Maybe Australia couldn't afford that, to buy a computer with 1 petabyte. But the world has developed in a way which is astonishing for everyone who is my age. And I don't understand anything about computers. I use a computer every day, still now, after retirement, but I don't understand it. And maybe some of you noticed that my heartbeat went a little bit faster when I noticed that you had problems with connecting to the screen. And I thought, well, I can't tell you anything because I don't know anything about that. The world of cyberspace is a world which can make life much easier or much more dangerous and tougher and harder. Virtual reality. What about when you grow up in virtual reality and play the computer games an hour a day or 10 hours a day or whatever, and you live in a virtual world? There is, for example, the computer game, which is usually not for us here, but pilots have to have computer games. They call that flight simulator. So they are being put into a flight simulator here in Sydney, and their order is to fly to Singapore. So there are in that flight simulator, and all the things in the pilot's place in a plane are the same in the simulator. So he gets the orders to start, and he starts up the engines, and he goes to the runway, and then he gets the signal to start, and he has checked everything in the cockpit, and he can start now. He starts up and goes up wonderfully in Sydney. And then there are some winds against him, and he has to redirect or redo what he does when he's flying. And then there is the threat of a terrorist attack in the plane behind him, and he's been trained to do what to do. And finally, after 8 hours or so, he lands in Singapore. It was not a good flight. It was quite a shaky flight. He lands in Singapore, and he opens the door of the cockpit, and he's in Sydney. Because you see, he has not really flown. He has flown in virtual reality. Just imagine that our kids grow up in virtual reality and we want to present them with a real God. A God who's alive, a God who can do things, a God who can be touched and who can touch us. Very difficult for people who live in virtual reality to accept such a God. When we go to church, we switch on virtual reality for 2 hours or 2.5 if the pastor does not go too long. And when we come out, we're the same as we were before. That's what we expected, isn't it? Or do you still expect that a service and coming to church is more than, in inverted commas, virtual reality? Is the God space on Sabbath morning just something you can switch on and switch off and you will always remain the same? You see, if nothing happens in my life and in yours today, nothing will happen tomorrow and the day after. And if nothing really has happened apart from getting wet in the baptismal pool, and then we dry off again and never get wet again through the showers which God gives to us, we've lived in virtual reality. And we get out of the cockpit and out of the church the same as we've always been. And our kids will wonder, does church do something in real reality? Does he affect the lives of our parents really? Or do we hang spiritual things into the cloud and we take it out of the clouds again next Sabbath when we come to church and nothing really is happening? There's a famous misquote by Thomas John Watson Sr. He was the CEO of International Business Machines, IBM, and it is said that he has said in the 40s of the last centuries, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. I would think that there are probably some in this church today who have 5 computers themselves. Here is the CEO of IBM in the 40s, who's supposed to have said, I think there might be a world market for maybe 5 computers. The world has changed, for the good and for the bad. I do hope that we somehow live beyond only virtual reality, expecting that when we open the Bible, when we kneel down for prayer, when we study the Sabbath school, that God touches us and that we come out of that as real people who have been moved forward towards heaven and have met a God who changes our lives even today. Are you living in more than virtual reality? John was reflecting on his life down there in his holiday resort, which was called Patmos at that time, sitting at the beach there and reflecting those 65 years ago when he was a young man, and he received the call, follow me, from the Master, and he and his brothers followed. His brother was no longer. All the others had gone. John was the only one who was left. And maybe sometimes the question mark came up to him. Was it really worthwhile? Or was that only virtual reality? Didn't he say, I will come again? And those 65 years ago, John saw him going up to heaven. Well, he would probably come next day. And when those men in white said, don't worry about it, this same Jesus whom you have seen going up to heaven, this same Jesus will come in like manner. He will come again. Oh yes, he would come next day because he loves us. And next day was gone. And the day after that was gone. And the year after that was gone. And Jesus hadn't come. And the first disciples were killed. And Jesus hadn't come. And here he was all by himself, standing up in Ephesus for the faith which he had learned from Jesus. And that's why he was on Patmos now, not a holiday island at that time. Was it virtual reality? And when he was thinking back of the time he had spent with Jesus, and thinking about that, what this Jesus would do for his life, the picture of Jesus came to him. And he was still among the 7 churches. Jesus was still alive. His promise had not changed. And John could see him again. And here, when he was on Patmos, when he saw him, John said, I fell at his feet as dead. But he, Jesus, laid his right hand on me, saying to me, don't be afraid, John. I am. Didn't you remember me as the great I am? Don't you remember when I said, before Abraham was, I am? In English, that's wrong. A wrong sentence. You would say, before Abraham was, I was, if you were before him. Did Jesus not know English or Greek or Aramaic? No, he said, when God says something, it is always true. When I told you 65 years ago, I will come again, and even if I don't come in 2,000 years, my promises are always true. I have not changed. John, don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am he who lives and was dead. And behold, I am alive forevermore. Then Philip came up to Jesus and said, Jesus, you're always talking about the Father. Come on, show us the Father. And Jesus said to Philip, Philip, have I been so long with you already? And you have not known me? He who has seen me has seen the Father. You want to have a picture of God? You want to present the picture of God through your life? Show people Jesus through your lives, and people may see God. It's now some over 50 years ago that I came to Australia the first time. I've come to Australia 3 times now in my life, and have lived almost half of my life in Australia. The first time was in the 60s, and I went to Avondale College. And there in Watson Hall, I don't know whether they've got that pulpit still. In Watson Hall we had worship for the guys every morning, and the ministerial students had to take the worship. And my first worship was coming on. I had tried to prepare it as well as I could, because we would be checked on it whether we would preach okay by our peers and by the teachers. And so I had all my notes and just wanted to put the notes onto the pulpit when I noticed there was a brass plaque on the pulpit. And that brass plaque said, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." I don't know whether I changed my address that morning, but that has accompanied me through my life of ministry. Sir, we would see Jesus. Jesus in virtual reality, that we leave this room the same as we were. And when we come home, we're as angry as we've always been to our family, to our kids, to our spouse, and nothing has changed. Or have we seen Jesus, who came a little bit closer, who touched us and changed us a little bit more into the image of God? I hope we see Jesus today as well. I love to study prophecy. And we heard in Sabbath school today something of the outcome of when Israel or Judah had to go to another country through Babylon into Medo-Persia, and we heard the story of Esther this morning. And here was Isaiah. Isaiah, a man who had surrendered his life to God. He had surrendered his life to God. And he was a prophet. Not only a prophet of God, but a prophet probably being paid by the king. In fact, the king was his cousin, as tradition says from the Talmud. And this prophet started to write a book. And he wrote already 5 chapters. And in those 5 chapters, he wrote 8 times, "Woe to the wicked! Woe to you bad ones! Woe to you! Woe to all of those!" 8 times in 5 chapters. How would you be invited to God? To the God you know, if the guy up there in front would all the time say, "Watch out, woe to you because you're bad people." You check it out. 8 times in 5 chapters. Something had to happen with the prophet. You see, when I left Avondale College, I wanted to go to New Guinea. And actually, when I lived in Germany, I wanted to be a missionary. We study about missionaries now, because missionaries have adventure. They fight with lions. And Lily was already here in Australia. I had met her in Yugoslavia 3 weeks before her parents thought that they would put her away from me and go to Australia quickly so that I wouldn't catch her. And so our friendship developed through letters. And those letters at that time took about 3 weeks each time. So in order to get an answer, I had to wait 6 weeks. That was in the olden days, before virtual reality, you know, when everything was still real. And letters were written on paper. Can you remember that time? You would put a stamp on it. And so after we had been in contact a little bit, I thought maybe the best way is to go to Australia, because she's here. And so I asked her, but I wanted to be sure about something. I asked her whether she would be my wife, because we had met already for a few hours in Yugoslavia, where I went through, so we knew each other wonderfully. And then wrote many letters during that 1 year. 1 year, actually, I wrote 6 letters a week. Some of them 15 pages long. The only evening I did not write a letter was Friday night. That was my preparation for the Sabbath. And I had to wait for the answers always 6 weeks. And when I wrote to her and asked her whether she would be my wife, I really painted it out wonderfully. We would be in Africa as missionaries. Our neighbors would be the lions and the giraffes and the rhinoceroses. And it would be wild and it would be dangerous. And she would have a few kids after a while. And she would be all by herself with the kids. And I would come home maybe twice a year for a week. And then I asked her, would you be my wife? And I was waiting for the answer for 6 weeks. And I heard a yes. And then I changed and I came to Australia so that no one else would take her away. And I came to Avondale College, and somehow Africa came out of my mind. But mission was in my mind. And this time mission was New Guinea. That was in the 60s. That was a different New Guinea from now. It was wild. It was one of the wildest spots in the world. And so I said to Lily, it's no longer Africa, it's New Guinea now. And when the division then, when we graduated, sent us a letter to fill out, and one of the questions was, where would you most like to work? Give us 3 choices, A, B, C. And I put under A, PNG. Under B, I put PNG. Under C, I had PNG. Didn't give them a chance. And so we were called to Germany. Of which I didn't think that anyone knew that I had finished college. It was a surprise, but we had said we will take the first call, in my mind, to PNG. I hadn't known that the prayers of my wife were stronger than mine. She never told me that she didn't want to go to New Guinea, because she grew up in a city. I grew up in the country. For her, city life was life. So she prayed that we wouldn't go to New Guinea, and her prayer was stronger. So we've lived practically all of our lives. We worked on 3 continents, in Europe, in 2 countries, in Germany for 17 years, in Switzerland for 4 years, in America for 6 months, and in Australia for the rest. That's something like, 25 years or something like that. But my first term, we arrived in Germany in February. Anyone has been in Germany in February? In the month of February? You wouldn't want to. It is freezing. And winter 1968, when we arrived in February by boat, because that was the cheapest way to come from Australia to Europe. When we arrived there in February and we started, we had $50 in our pocket and had no money to buy an oven. It was minus 20 degrees. We had to come very close to each other to warm each other, to have a little bit of heat. So everyone, I started to visit people. No car, of course, at that time. You were walking or sliding with a bus in winter when the snow was so deep on the road. And I visited people, 5, 6 people a day. You couldn't do more because you didn't have a car. And so I came to the people, you're Brother Joseit, you're our new young minister. You must be freezing, don't you? Oh, yes, I am. Would you have a cup of coffee? Oh, yes, of course. And the only coffee I knew was from plant, what sort of a plant is it? Chicory. Correct. That was Adventist coffee. I didn't know anything else, and I had never expected to see anything else in an Adventist church. Everyone, would you have a cup of coffee? Oh, of course, sure. Until it dawned on me, they mean something else. So I always had to say to them, sorry, I don't drink this stuff. I drink real coffee, the chicory stuff. And then I thought, I have to say this in every home. And I wanted to change it. So I had a sermon. I've forgotten what the topic was. It was definitely not "So we want to see Jesus." And in that sermon I had one sentence which was so long. And I put all the things I didn't like with the church. I put all of those things into this one sentence and said, being a Christian is not only not to do this, and to do this, and not to drink coffee, and not to do this, but the sentence was packed. And I was so young, you know. And I had really given it to them. Woe to you. And at the door, someone who has got my present hair color came to me and he said, "Brother Joseit, preach the word. The Bible doesn't speak about coffee." He taught me a lesson. I still don't drink any coffee. But look, Isaiah had not seen Jesus. There is something happening in the life of Isaiah. In the 6th chapter. Why in the 6th chapter? Because he was a self-made prophet evidently before, called by his cousin the king maybe, who had given him a good job. Nepotism, you know. A good job for my cousin, being a prophet. And for 5 chapters, Isaiah evidently went on his own steam. And we see his change in the 6th chapter. You see, the calling of the apostles was at the beginning of the Gospels, wasn't it? Not at the end of the Gospels. The calling of Moses was at the beginning of Exodus. The calling of Jeremiah was in the 1st chapter of Jeremiah. It was in the opening chapters when a person was called by God. Here, he went, as I see it, on his own steam for 5 chapters. And he maybe told really the word of the Lord. But that was not who the Lord was. There are some woes after the 6th chapter as well. But only with the right vision of God. When we think of Jesus, in chapter 5 of Matthew, we hear the blessings. In chapter 23 of Matthew, we hear the woes. So at first, people had to get to know God before they were ready for the woe. I hope I had learned a little bit of a lesson there from that dear brother at the door who greeted me and said, "Brother Joseit, preach the word." Uzziah had reigned Judah for 52 years. He was the best king Judah had after Solomon, David and Solomon. He ruled for 52 years, and his rule was very much accepted by the people. And somehow, he put himself more and more onto the throne. Somehow, it went to his head that he was king and no one more. And somehow, others started to believe that Uzziah, the king, was sitting on the throne, maybe alone. It went so much into his head that he said, "I'm now king, I can also be priest." And he did what only priests could do. He went into the temple and sacrificed on the altar of incense what was only the priest's job. You remember the story, what happened after that? He became leprous. And what happened with lepers in the Old Testament? They were no longer living with their families in the palace. They were outside. So the last months and maybe a couple of years of his life, Uzziah the king was somewhere outside of town, outside of his house, as a leper, because he claimed to be alone on the throne. He claimed to be God, directing who had to give the sacrifices. It was only in chapter 6 of Isaiah that Uzziah died, after 52 years. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Where was he? Sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. We don't know how he saw the Lord. Actually, he does not describe the Lord there. He describes the angels. Evidently, the vision of the Lord was so powerful that it did something in his life. He had not seen the Lord before, you know. God was virtual reality. And when he stepped out of the temple, when he stepped out of virtual reality, in reality there was no change. And he could only say, woe to you, watch out. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. That's an interesting story. This is the only time that seraphims are named seraphims in the Bible. But we have their description also in Ezekiel and in the book of Revelation with those 6 wings. But it's interesting. 4 of the wings were used to practically say, God, you're the only holy one. And only 2 of the wings were used for work. With 2 they flew. With 2 they covered his face. I'm in the presence of God. I cannot really look into the face of God because he's too holy. With 2 they covered their feet. And when you go into the Orient today, feet have a special significance. You remember when someone threw a shoe at, who was it, at Bush, I think. That was Middle Eastern custom, which showed you're the lowest of the low. They covered their feet because they were so low, those angels. God and feet of a human being who was treading the dust of the earth could not fit together. With 2, they did their work. Seraphims, evidently, the job of seraphims was to rule out any impurity in the presence of God, to rule out all sin from the presence of God. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Is God still a holy God? See, I love the picture of God, that he's one who waits for his son to come back home. He looks to me like a father with his binoculars every day and saying, Peter, why can't I find you? Why don't you come back? Putting in my heart a desire to come home again. He wants me to sit on his lap, doesn't he? The father picture is a wonderful picture of God's closeness, of his Abba, which says Daddy. So the embrace, I feel the embrace of God, but that's not the only picture of God. God is also a holy God. In your invocation, I notice that you've got the holy God in there as well. That does not mean that kids can't say E or R in church. That means that we recognize that nobody is holy but God, and that he wants to draw us to him and change our lives so that others who might see us might think that we are holy only because we are connected with God. Holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of His glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of Him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. That's a picture of God as He travels with the children of Israel through the desert. Wherever God was light, or there was smoke, or there were clouds. It was visible where He was, although nobody saw Him face to face. And those who saw God, Moses and Elijah, what did they see? They saw mercy. They saw grace. They saw love. That is what God was in the Old Testament. When I worked on this sermon, I thought there may be, even in an Adventist church, still some who believe that the God of the Old Testament is a God of judgment, and the God of the New Testament is a God of cuddles, the God of love. And so I put into, and that's what I use the internet for sometimes, I put into the computer, God of love, Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of the God of love. Try it out. And then I put into the computer as a search, God of justice, New Testament. And the New Testament is full of the God of justice. You see, He is the great I Am. He does not change. We see Him sometimes different. He always presents Himself first as the God who's close to us, as a God who's holy but who is also loving and caring, before He ever says that He's the God of judgment and justice. So I said, the first time in Isaiah we hear that. That's the 9th time we hear the word woe in Isaiah. But this time it's not woe to you, woe to them, woe to the ugly and the nasty ones. This time it's woe to me. Have you ever had that experience? I hope we all have had that experience and have it continuously in our lives. Because when we come into the presence of the Holy God, we start to understand who we are. And that's not virtual reality. The closer we come to God, the more we sense how holy He is and how far away we are from Him. You see, in our church we sometimes have these perfectionists who believe they could make it. And I've made it. I haven't sinned now for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Have you met those people? I have. And I've heard sermons like that. Holiness only comes when we stand in the shadow of Christ. There is no other holiness. There is only holiness in Him. And perfection only when we are covered by Him. Perfection never from ourselves. So I said, woe to me, because for the first time I've seen who I am. And I can only see that in the presence of God. I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. Beg your pardon? A preacher? If a preacher does not see that he's a person of unclean lips, he has no right to preach. Because he will only present himself. And people will not see Jesus. Sir, I want to see Jesus. And I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For I've been in the presence of God, the Holy God. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. No longer was Isaiah in the King. Isaiah had to die because he was sitting too much on the throne of his whole people, of his relatives. and he saw himself alone on the throne. The King, the Lord of hosts, the God of heaven, the holy God, is sitting on the throne. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. That's an interesting thought here. When we study every word of this brings us to a place, to the only place where there is salvation. There is no other place. You have to come to the altar, where it burns, where blood flows, where there is fire. And he touched my mouth with it and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips." Remember the coal from the altar? "This has touched my lips. Your iniquity is taken away and your sin purged." I'll just go through another picture so that this comes a little bit closer to us. I thought I had it. There it is. Where did the coal come from? Did it come from here? It came from this altar, not from that one here. It came from the altar which pre-shadows the cross of Christ in the New Testament. We don't go to that altar anymore, do we? Who has brought the last sheep to the altar in the temple? I don't think any one of us here. That coal came from where the cross stands now, where the blood of the sacrifice flowed into the altar and into the coals, and where the blood was mingled with fire. And the angel who kept the holiness of God and brought us closer to the holy God so that we might be holy as well. That angel, that coal was being brought into the most holy, into the presence of God, where we see the holiness of God. No, beyond the cross, there is no longer a curtain between us and God. There is no longer that we need another priest. Christ is the priest. So let's go back to... sorry, that was one too far. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Then I said, "Here am I. Send me." Dear God, here am I. I want to go to New Guinea. And I want to... What about my salary? And how is my family covered? And what sort of a house can we live in? I heard that New Guinea is a little bit backward, yeah? That was in the 60s. So do you give me a little bit of the comfort of Australia? So we negotiate with God. Here I am. I will go where I want to go. No. Here am I. Send me. Lord, you've got all the freedom to do with my life whatever you want to do, because I want to be in your presence every day. And I want that those fiery coals from the altar, where the blood of Jesus flowed into the coals and was mixed with the fire of the Holy Spirit, where that touched my lips and my life, so that when I come out of it, I have not just lived in virtual reality, but in the reality of a holy, of a caring, of a loving Father who is my God. Send me. Not send me there where you want me to go, but send me where I want to go, but send me there where you want me to go. What about the Isaiah? Isaiah is called the gospel prophet. Would you call him the gospel prophet? after reading Isaiah 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? I wouldn't. Not very much of the gospel of the salvation in those 5 chapters. They're good chapters, and they're true. The true description of the horrors of the people whom he describes. But that was not a presentation of God. Sir, we want to see Jesus. Before God tells us that he's the judge, because before that he tells us how he wants to change us, how he wants to make us. And Isaiah started to see the cross. And Isaiah also started to see the one who would lead him as a shepherd, whom he would follow like a sheep. Because Isaiah had seen the Lord. And now we have, in chapter 7, God will put a miracle. A virgin will be with child, and you will call him Emmanuel. God, the God who loves you, with you. And when you go through Isaiah 7 and 9 and 11 and 53 especially, what a God. I can now understand that we call Isaiah the gospel prophet, because he puts the cross of Christ, and the Christ who leads out in our lives, he puts him before us, so that we will have a new vision of a God who is both holy and loving and caring for us. Whom shall I send? Here am I. Send me. And when the question comes, is God a simulated virtual reality God whom we switch off after we get out of the service again? What happens in our lives when we see the Lord? Do we see the one who has gone to the cross for us, who mixes his blood with the power and the fire of the Holy Spirit, heals us, changes us, and makes us new? When I saw the Lord, have I seen a real God? And when I come home, will my family, my neighbors, my friends who know me well, notice that something has changed because I've been in the presence of a holy, loving God? Amen.